Dearest listeners, there exists no prison more exquisite than that forged by our own bitterness, nor any chains more binding than those we fashion from ancient grievances. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most unsettling tale of a marriage contracted not for fortune nor for alliance, but for the coldest revenge imaginable, the ingenious annihilation of an inheritance, separating blood from power, severing legacy from lineage as payment for decades of cruelty. A young bride who married for love, only to discover herself nothing more than an instrument in her husband's calculated vengeance against a dead man. A marriage bed transformed into a battlefield, a womb deliberately denied its purpose, and a terrible secret that would shatter an innocent heart into 1,000 pieces. If tales of passion twisted into punishment intrigue you as they do this author, pray honor me with your subscription to this channel and bestow a small token of approval upon this humble chronicle. Your support ensures that more such stories of hearts, entangled in the complexities of our era, shall reach your ears. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest brandy, must be savored properly. The spring of 1815 found London society in particularly jubilant spirits, for Wellington had at last defeated the Corsican upstart, and the Tun could return to its proper occupation of matrimonial scheming. It was during this season that Miss Eliza Brennan made her debut, stepping into the glittering ballrooms of Mayfair with all the tremulous hope that characterized young ladies of modest fortune and excellent breeding. Eliza possessed that particular beauty which transformed the ordinary into something sublime, not through extraordinary features, but through the genuine warmth that radiated from her countenance. Her gray eyes held an unfortunate tendency toward romanticism, betraying her addiction to the lending libraries that her practical elder sister, Margaret, had warned would fill her head with nonsensical expectations. The Brennan family occupied that precarious position where gentility outweighed fortune. Eliza's father, the late Reverend Thomas Brennan, had left his widow and daughters dependent upon modest competence and the generosity of distant relations. Margaret had already secured herself by marrying Mr. William Hartford, a prosperous merchant, and now served as Eliza's chaperone during the season. Among the season's eligible bachelors, one figure stood conspicuously apart. Marcus Thornley, 5th Marquess of Wintermere, had returned to London after years of absence, and his presence caused considerable speculation. At 31, he possessed austere handsomeness, hardened by habitual severity. His gray eyes held no warmth, no invitation to intimacy. They were the eyes of a man who had looked too long upon suffering and had frozen his capacity for joy. Those who remembered the previous Marquess spoke of him in hushed tones, for the 4th Marquess had been renowned for his particular brand of tyranny. The old man had ruled his household with iron discipline, punishing every display of sensitivity in his son, mocking his preference for books over blood sports. Young Marcus had been subjected to methodical cruelty that destroyed everything gentle in his nature. The old Marquess had died the previous autumn, and Marcus had inherited considerable wealth and a wound upon his spirit so profound that it had transformed him into a mere shell of humanity. Society expected him to marry, but his manner suggested no inclination toward companionship. At Lady Thornbury's ball, Eliza first encountered Wintermere. Margaret approached with barely suppressed excitement. Lady Thornbury wished to introduce the Marquess to several eligible young ladies. Margaret saw opportunity where others saw only a forbidding nobleman with reputation for coldness. The introduction proceeded with mechanical precision. The Marquess bowed without particular interest, his expression betraying no reaction to yet another debutante. Yet something peculiar occurred when Eliza's fan slipped from her fingers. As Wintermere retrieved it and their eyes met, something flickered in those cold gray depths. Perhaps recognition, perhaps merely surprise at his own involuntary response. The moment shattered quickly. He murmured conventional pleasantries and retreated toward the card room. But Eliza remained transfixed, her romantic nature immediately constructing narratives of wounded souls requiring understanding. The following weeks brought encounters that appeared accidental, yet occurred with suspicious frequency. At Hatchard's one rainy afternoon, she noticed not merely his presence, but the manner in which the silence seemed to deepen around him, how other patrons gave him a space that was not demanded but granted. She found herself observing his hands as he turned the pages of a volume, noting the strength contained in his fingers, the careful reverence with which he handled the binding, and felt an inexplicable warmth rise to her cheeks, immediately reproaching herself for such an indiscretion. In Hyde Park, she encountered him mounted upon a magnificent black stallion, and the ease with which he controlled the powerful animal suggested a man more comfortable with horses than with human society. At Theatre Royal, they found themselves in adjacent boxes, close enough that Eliza could observe how his severe features softened almost imperceptibly during the more moving passages of the play. Each meeting remained scrupulously proper, yet Eliza felt herself drawn deeper into fascination with this enigmatic man who held the world at distance. She began to construct elaborate theories about his character, imagining the suffering that had produced such profound isolation. What Eliza could not know was that Windermere had indeed noticed her, but not for reasons her hopeful heart imagined. She was being evaluated according to criteria having nothing to do with affection and everything to do with vengeance, so meticulously planned it would have chilled her blood. The morning that altered Eliza's path arrived in late April. Margaret had organized a literary salon at her Bedford Square residence. The Marquis's unexpected attendance caused considerable flutter among the assembled ladies. Eliza had been asked to read from Wordsworth. She chose passages from Tintern Abbey, those lines about nature's capacity to heal the weary spirit. Her voice carried through the drawing room with earnestness that betrayed deep connection to the words. She did not see the Marquis enter until she reached those particular lines about the still, sad music of humanity. Some instinct made her glance up, and she found him standing motionless, his expression unreadable, yet somehow suggesting he had received an unexpected blow. What followed was their first genuine conversation, revealing depths to the Marquis that Eliza had only imagined. He spoke of poetry with passion, suggesting someone who had found solace in literature when human connection proved too dangerous. He demonstrated intimate familiarity with Wordsworth, suggesting repeated readings, the kind undertaken with texts serving as lifelines. Eliza responded with matching enthusiasm, revealing her own attachment to the Romantic poets, her belief in emotional authenticity over social performance. She spoke with unguarded enthusiasm, never considering she was providing a man of deliberate purpose the precise information required for his decision. The conversation extended beyond propriety until Margaret intervened. But before withdrawing, the Marquis made a request that set Eliza's heart racing. Might he call upon her? Might he take her driving in Hyde Park? Eliza floated through the remainder of the day, convinced she had glimpsed the true man behind the forbidding exterior, certain she had been granted access to a heart that might yet learn hope. She did not know that Windermere had indeed made a decision, but one born of cold assessment. She possessed required qualities: adequate breeding, modest fortune precluding mercenary motives, romantic temperament that would interpret his attention as something other than strategy, and gentle nature that would suffer silently rather than create scandal when she discovered truth. She would do perfectly for the revenge he had been planning since that moment beside his father's deathbed when the old Marquis had clutched his wrist with dying strength and demanded Marcus produce an heir. The old man's final words had been not of love, but of legacy, of duty owed to ancestors and descendants. Marcus had made his promise, but twisted by decades of abuse into something monstrous. He would marry. He would perform duty to the extent society demanded. But the true wealth and power of Windermere would pass to someone bearing not a drop of Thornley blood, a final severing of everything his father had held sacred. He required only a wife innocent enough not to understand his intention until far too late. And Miss Eliza Brennan, with her romantic ideals and trusting gray eyes, would serve his purpose admirably. The courtship that followed might have appeared romantic to casual observers. The Marquis called upon Eliza with flattering regularity. He secured invitations to events she attended. He danced with her twice at Almack's, that sacred maximum indicating serious intention. He drove her through Hyde Park in his curricle. To Eliza, these weeks represented fulfillment of every romantic fantasy. She interpreted the Marquis's reserve as evidence of deep feeling constrained by past suffering. She read significance into his silences, convinced herself she alone possessed the key to unlocking the heart he guarded so carefully. She failed entirely to notice what Margaret observed with growing unease, that the Marquis's courtship, while technically proper, contained none of the warmth expected from a genuinely attached man. His compliments possessed a quality of studied selection rather than spontaneous admiration. His attention felt measured rather than compelled. Margaret mentioned concerns to her husband, who dismissed them with masculine confidence that a Marquis of 30,000 a year could be permitted his eccentricities. She attempted warning Eliza, but her warnings fell upon ears deafened by infatuation. The proposal followed impeccable form. The Marquis requested an interview with Mrs. Brennan, presented extraordinarily generous settlements, and asked for Eliza's hand with proper attention to protocol. Mrs. Brennan, despite lingering unease about his coldness, could not refuse such an advantageous match. Eliza received his proposal in Margaret's drawing room. The Marquis delivered expected sentiments about esteem and respect. Eliza, hearing what her heart wished rather than what was actually said, interpreted formal words as shyness. She accepted with tears of joy, believing herself the most fortunate of women. She had secured what she believed was a genuine love match. The Marquis received her acceptance with a bow and kiss upon her hand, betraying nothing of his thoughts. He arranged for a wedding as soon as banns could be read, explaining business required returning to his Derbyshire estate before summer heat made London unbearable. The truth was simpler. He wished to complete his revenge before time or conscience might weaken his resolve. The wedding took place on a perfect June morning. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress and carried roses from Margaret's garden. She thought herself radiantly happy, believing she had married a man who cherished her deeply. Standing at the altar, repeating vows she believed would bind them in sacred union of hearts, Eliza had no conception of the nightmare into which she was stepping. The wedding night awaited, and with it, the beginning of Eliza's true education about the man she had married. Wintermere Hall stood in Derbyshire's Peak District, a massive stone edifice housing Thornley Marquesses for 6 generations. Its grey walls rose against the hills like a fortress, reflecting sunlight without seeming to admit it. Eliza arrived as the new Marchioness in late afternoon after 2 days of strained travel. The Marquis had remained courteous but distant, treating her with formal politeness rather than bridal affection. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thornley, showed Eliza to chambers that had belonged to previous Marchionesses, well appointed but curiously impersonal. Eliza learned the Marquis's chambers occupied the opposite wing, an arrangement Mrs. Thornley explained as traditional. The wedding dinner proceeded in cavernous formality. Afterward, the Marquis suggested she retire early given travel exhaustion. He would join her later. Eliza prepared nervously for her wedding night, possessing only haziest understanding of what would occur. The Marquis arrived perhaps an hour later. What followed was, in strictly technical terms, consummation of the marriage. He performed his husbandly duties with mechanical efficiency, showing neither passion nor cruelty, but simply determination to complete a necessary act. When it ended, the Marquis withdrew immediately to his chambers with nothing more than a formal good night. Eliza felt confused and bereft. She had anticipated awkwardness, but also some element of tenderness. Still, she consoled herself, first experiences were difficult. Time and familiarity would bring the warmth she craved. What Eliza did not know was that her husband had just performed the first act of his carefully planned revenge. Consummation had been necessary for legal validity, but it would be the last time he would risk creating the heir his father had demanded. From this night forward, the Marquis would ensure through deliberate means that his wife's womb remained empty. The pattern established itself with devastating consistency. The Marquis maintained husbandly visits approximately twice weekly, always with the same dispassionate efficiency. He would arrive, perform what he viewed as duty, and depart with minimal conversation and no affection. One such night in late July, after a particularly mechanical encounter, Marcus returned to his own chambers and closed the door behind him. He leaned against it for a moment longer than necessary, his jaw clenched tight. He looked down at his own hands as though they belonged to a stranger, and for the briefest instant, something flickered across his features, a flash of self-loathing so intense it might have passed for pain. Then his iron discipline reasserted itself, crushing the wayward emotion before it could take root. The revenge brought satisfaction, certainly, but it was a dish served in the most absolute and glacial emptiness, and some part of him, a part he refused to acknowledge, recoiled from the void he had created. Eliza gradually recognized something was profoundly wrong. The encounters brought neither pleasure nor connection. Her husband treated her body with impersonal attention he might give correspondence requiring his signature. What disturbed her most was something she lacked experience to name. She noticed her husband's behavior followed a peculiar pattern. At the last moment, he would withdraw abruptly in a manner leaving her confused. She possessed no framework for understanding. She assumed this was simply how marital relations proceeded. Perhaps romantic literature had been misleading. But as weeks became months, Eliza began noticing other women her age, whose waistlines expanded, whose families announced expected arrivals. Everyone seemed to assume an heir would arrive in due course. Except the expected signs never appeared for Eliza. Her courses continued with perfect regularity, month after month. No morning sickness, no fatigue, no symptoms she heard other women discussing. At first, she assumed it was simply a matter of time. But as months accumulated, 3, then 4, then approaching 6, she began worrying. Was something wrong with her? Was she barren? Was this why the Marquis treated her with such coldness? The worry transformed gradually into shame. She began feeling defective, inadequate to the most basic duty of a wife. She noticed servants exchanging glances, caught tail ends of conversations ceasing abruptly when she entered rooms. Margaret wrote frequently, letters full of news about her own pregnancy. Each letter became small torture, reminder of Eliza's apparent failure. Eliza attempted discussing concerns with the Marquis, but he deflected every effort. When she finally gathered courage to ask directly whether he was disappointed in her inability to conceive, he responded with cold dismissal that the matter was not worth discussion. The dismissal stung more than criticism would have. It reinforced her conviction that she was somehow deficient, that her husband had recognized this flaw. Her life at Windermere Hall settled into pattern of exquisite loneliness. The Marquis maintained a schedule, ensuring they spent minimal time together beyond formal dinners and periodic nighttime visits. He treated her with unfailing courtesy, but absolutely no warmth. Eliza attempted finding purpose in household management, but Mrs. Thornley had run Windermere Hall for decades and made clear she neither required nor welcomed interference from a mistress who had not yet justified her position by producing an heir. She wrote long letters to her mother and Margaret, but found herself unable to articulate the true nature of her unhappiness. How could she explain that her marriage felt like a prison of loneliness? The autumn brought news that Margaret had been safely delivered of a healthy son, little Thomas Hartford. The letter arrived on a day when Eliza's courses had just begun again, the 6th month of marriage, with no sign of expected pregnancy. She wept that night, alone in her chambers, feeling herself a failure. She did not understand that her body was functioning perfectly, that the fault lay in her husband's intentional prevention of conception. She knew only that she was desperately unhappy, that romantic dreams had crumbled into dust, and that she was trapped in a marriage bringing neither love nor children, nor any sense of purpose. And winter was coming, when Derbyshire hills would be locked in snow and ice, and Eliza would find herself more isolated than ever. But winter would bring something else, a tragedy that would finally tear away the veil of ignorance and force Eliza to confront terrible truth about what had been done to her. The letter arrived in early December. It came from William Hartford, and its contents shattered what remained of Eliza's fragile equilibrium. Margaret had taken ill shortly after birth. What began as normal post-delivery fatigue had progressed to fever, then delirium, then the final crisis claiming so many women in childbed. She had died 3 days prior to the letter's dispatch, leaving behind infant son Thomas and a devastated husband. Mrs. Brennan, already in delicate health, had collapsed upon receiving news. The physician suggested the shock had precipitated a crisis of her heart, and she was not expected to survive more than a few days. William Hartford, overwhelmed by grief and care of an infant, begged Eliza to come immediately. Margaret's final wishes had been for Eliza to take responsibility for her son should she not survive. Eliza found the Marquis in his study and requested permission to travel immediately to London. She did not phrase it as a question. Circumstances clearly demanded her presence. The Marquis would escort her himself, he informed her. The circumstances required his presence as head of her family. They would depart the following morning. They arrived in London to find Mrs. Brennan still clinging to life. Eliza spent 3 days at her mother's bedside before Mrs. Brennan died peacefully with her remaining daughter beside her. 2 funerals followed in rapid succession. Eliza moved through the ceremonies in a fog of grief, barely aware of the Marquis's steady presence. William Hartford proved himself utterly incapable of managing an infant. His grief had paralyzed him. The child's wet nurse looked to Eliza for direction, clearly relieved that someone capable had arrived. Little Thomas was a beautiful child, dark-haired and gray-eyed like his mother. Eliza found herself drawn to him with surprising intensity, this small person representing all that remained of Margaret. The weeks that followed the funerals passed in a haze of mourning and newfound purpose. Eliza remained in London, having taken up residence in the Hartford household to care for Thomas. She spent her days entirely devoted to the infant, finding in his needs a distraction from her overwhelming grief. In the quiet hours when Thomas slept, she would hold him close, marveling at the perfection of his tiny features, seeing in him echoes of her beloved sister. She discovered depths of maternal feeling she had not known she possessed. The fierce protectiveness that rose in her when Thomas cried, the joy that filled her heart when he smiled in his sleep, the tender devotion with which she supervised every aspect of his care. These feelings awakened something within her that months of barren marriage had left dormant. The Marquis maintained a respectful distance during this period, attending to business in the city while Eliza mourned. He called upon her periodically to inquire after her welfare and to offer whatever assistance she might require, but he made no demands upon her time or attention. It was after nearly a month of this arrangement, when Eliza had established a profound bond with her nephew and found in his care the only source of meaning in her grief-stricken existence, that the Marquis requested a private audience. She was holding Thomas when he entered the Hartford drawing room, and she looked up with the wariness that had become habitual in his presence, wondering what matter required such formality. He had been thinking about the situation, he informed her, with that careful precision that characterized all his pronouncements. Young Thomas required a family. William Hartford was clearly unfit to raise the boy alone, and his intentions to remarry suggested he would be relieved of the burden. Meanwhile, she and the Marquis remained without an heir, despite months of marriage, and society would soon begin to whisper about the failure that her barrenness represented. As he spoke the word, barrenness, he saw the raw pain flash across her face, the almost imperceptible flinch as though he had struck her. For a fraction of a second, he felt something uncomfortable, a dissonance in his carefully orchestrated revenge. Her pain was a necessary variable in his equation, but it proved more unpleasant to witness than he had anticipated. He immediately suppressed the sensation, refocusing on the objective that had consumed him since his father's death. The momentary discomfort was irrelevant. Only the completion of his vengeance mattered. He proposed an arrangement that would address all these concerns. They would formally adopt Thomas as their son and heir to the Wintermere fortune. The boy would take the Thornley name, would be raised with every advantage their wealth could provide, would inherit the vast properties, the houses, the investments, everything the Marquess possessed, save the title itself. The title, bound by law and patent of creation, must pass to the nearest male relative of Thornley blood, some distant cousin Marcus barely knew. But that unfortunate gentleman would inherit nothing save an empty honor, a name without substance. The true wealth and power of Wintermere, accumulated over generations, would pass to Thomas Hertford, a child bearing not a single drop of Thornley blood. It was, he suggested, with the faintest hint of satisfaction in his cold voice, a most convenient solution for all parties involved. Eliza stared at him, holding the sleeping infant, trying to process what he was proposing. Some part of her, the part that had been systematically damaged by months of subtle cruelty, heard only the word barren and felt the sting of her presumed inadequacy. But another part, the part that had awakened to fierce protective love the moment she held her nephew, recognized the opportunity being offered. Thomas would have everything her modest family could never provide. He would receive the education, connections, future that Margaret had wanted for her son. He would not grow up in the awkward position of a merchant's child trying to navigate the blurred boundaries between trade and gentility. He would be raised with every advantage of wealth and station that the Wintermere fortune could provide. And she would have a child to love, a purpose to fill the emptiness, a reason to continue existing in the loveless shell of her marriage. She agreed to the adoption with tears streaming down her face, believing herself grateful for her husband's generosity, convinced this unexpected kindness represented a turning point in their relationship. She did not yet understand she had just given her husband exactly what he wanted, an arrangement satisfying society's expectations while ensuring that everything his father had valued, the Wintermere wealth, lands, and legacy, would pass to someone bearing not a drop of the old Marquess's blood. The title would persist as an empty shell, while the substance of the family's power would be severed completely from the Thornley line. The revenge was complete, and Eliza herself had just sealed its success. But truth would not remain hidden much longer, and when it finally emerged, it would destroy everything Eliza had believed about her marriage, her husband, and herself. The legal arrangements for Thomas's adoption proceeded with remarkable speed. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post, noting that the Marquess and Marchioness of Wintermere had graciously adopted the infant son of her late sister, ensuring the boy would receive every advantage as heir to the Wintermere fortune. Society accepted the arrangement with minimal gossip. Adoption among nobility, while not common, was sufficiently precedented that it raised few eyebrows. The distinction between inheriting the title and inheriting the wealth was understood by those familiar with the complexities of entailment and patents of nobility. The distant Thornley cousin would have his marquisate, while young Thomas Hertford would have everything that truly mattered. Eliza returned to Wintermere Hall in January with Thomas and full complement of nursery staff. For the first time since her marriage, Eliza found purpose and even moments of genuine happiness. Thomas thrived under her care, growing rapidly from helpless newborn to alert infant. The Marquess, meanwhile, withdrew even further into patterns of isolation. He had achieved his objective, an arrangement ensuring that his father's legacy would be torn asunder, the title separated from the fortune that gave it meaning. He discontinued his nighttime visits to Eliza's chambers entirely. The excuse was obvious. The child required her attention. But the servants noticed what Eliza did not, that the Marquess seemed satisfied in a manner he had not been before, that he carried himself with the air of a man who had accomplished a difficult task. Mrs. Thornley watched with growing disapproval. Something about the Marquis's treatment of his young wife struck her as particularly intentional and cold. She was not alone in her concerns. Sarah, the young woman who had accompanied Thomas from the Hertford household, possessed more education than typical nursery staff. She had been treated almost as family by Margaret Hertford and had heard Margaret speak with concern about Eliza's marriage. Margaret, in her final weeks, had spoken to Sarah about worries for her sister. She had mentioned something strange about the Marquis, some conversation she had overheard between her husband and a medical man, some discussion about deliberate prevention of conception. Sarah had dismissed it at the time. But now, watching Lady Windermere pour love into an adopted child while her husband treated her with such measured indifference, the fragments took on darker significance. She began paying closer attention. She noticed the Marquess never entered the nursery, never asked about Thomas's progress, never displayed typical paternal interest. She observed Lady Windermere seemed relieved rather than disappointed by her husband's absence from her chambers. And gradually, Sarah began piecing together the truth of what had been done to her former mistress's beloved sister. Remembering the worry that had clouded Margaret's eyes in those final weeks, recalling the way her dying mistress had grasped Sarah's hand and whispered her fears for Eliza's future, Sarah felt that the silence would be a final betrayal to the woman who had treated her with such kindness. The confrontation began with a simple question. Sarah found Lady Windermere in the nursery one February afternoon, holding Thomas while he slept. Sarah asked, with careful delicacy, whether Lady Windermere had ever wondered why she had not conceived naturally before the adoption. Had she never thought it strange that a young, healthy woman should fail to produce a child after so many months? Eliza looked up, startled and defensive. She had thought about it constantly. She had assumed herself barren, had believed herself a failure. Sarah hesitated, choosing her words with extreme care. She begged forgiveness for her presumption, she began. But there were things that had troubled her. Small observations that individually meant nothing, but together formed a disturbing pattern. The way his lordship never touched Lady Windermere in public, even the most perfunctory gestures of marital affection. The evident relief in her mistress's countenance when he had departed for London. The complete cessation of his nocturnal visits the moment Thomas's adoption was finalized. These were small things, perhaps, but they had gnawed at Sarah's conscience. And then she remembered something her former mistress, Lady Windermere's beloved sister, had mentioned during those final fevered weeks. Margaret had overheard a fragment of conversation between Mr. Hertford and their physician, something about the Marquis of Windermere making inquiries, seeking medical advice about methods to perform marital duties while deliberately preventing conception. Margaret had been too ill to pursue the matter, had dismissed it as confusion born of laudanum and fever. But Sarah, watching the aftermath of the adoption, had begun to see how the pieces fitted together into a terrible whole. The Marquis had deliberately prevented conception. From the very beginning, he had ensured his seed would never take root. The strange withdrawal Eliza had noticed, it had all been premeditated to fulfill appearance of marital duty while guaranteeing barrenness. He had never intended for her to bear his children. The entire marriage had been a charade designed to satisfy society while ensuring the Windermere bloodline ended with him. And Thomas's adoption had been the final act, an heir to the fortune-satisfying society's expectations, but one carrying not a drop of his father's blood. The true Windermere legacy would pass to a stranger while the title became an empty honor. Eliza sat frozen as truth crashed over her in waves of increasing horror. Every moment of her marriage reframed itself in this terrible light. The mechanical nature of his visits, the careful withdrawal, the cold indifference to her distress, the sudden willingness to adopt, the complete cessation of relations once adoption was accomplished. She had not been a wife. She had been an instrument used to achieve revenge so cold her mind recoiled from comprehending it. The rage that rose in her was unlike anything Eliza had ever experienced. It burned away romantic illusions, scorched through careful patience and submission, and left pure fury. She She handed Thomas to Sarah with careful gentleness despite trembling hands. She rose with deliberate control, and she walked toward her husband's study with grim determination of a woman who had finally recognized the full extent of her betrayal. The confrontation that followed would shatter what remained of the Marquis's careful facade. Eliza entered the study without knocking. She closed the door with deliberate care, then turned to face him with an expression he had never before seen. She knew, she informed him. She knew about the intentional prevention of conception. She knew about his revenge against his father. She knew their entire marriage had been a studied deception designed to use her as instrument of vengeance. She demanded explanation, not excuses, not justifications, simply truth, delivered plainly. The Marquis rose slowly, his expression shifting through surprise to anger to something that might have been resignation. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, perhaps because the game was over, he told her the truth. His father had been a monster. Not the dramatic kind from Gothic novels, but the insidious variety destroying children's spirits through methodical cruelty disguised as discipline. Every display of emotion had been punished. Every sign of sensitivity had been mocked. Books had been his only refuge. Poetry had provided solace when human connection proved too dangerous. He had learned to suppress everything gentle, to present the cold exterior his father demanded. When his father lay dying, the old Marquis had made his final demand: produce an heir, continue the bloodline, ensure the Wintermere legacy endured. Not out of love, the old man had been incapable of that, but out of pride in lineage and determination that his son should not escape the duty owed to generations past. Marcus had made his decision in that moment. He would marry to satisfy society. But the legacy his father treasured would be torn apart absolutely. The bloodline would end. The title would pass to some distant cousin who would inherit nothing but an empty honor. And the true wealth and power of Wintermere, the fortune accumulated over generations, the lands, the properties, everything that gave the title meaning, would pass to a child bearing not one drop of Thornley blood. He had required a wife innocent enough not to understand what he was doing, romantic enough to interpret his attention as affection. Eliza had met all requirements perfectly. He had never intended to hurt her specifically. She had simply been the appropriate tool for his purpose. Her pain had been incidental to his objective. Thomas's adoption had been fortunate timing. But once the opportunity presented itself, he had recognized it as the perfect culmination of his plan. He delivered this explanation in the same cold tone he had used throughout their marriage, betraying no shame, no regret, no awareness he had committed profound betrayal. Eliza listened with mounting horror, not just to what he said, but to how he said it. The complete absence of empathy, the calm recitation of premeditated cruelty, the utter failure to recognize he had treated another human being as an object. She told him his father had succeeded beyond imagination, that the old Marquis had transformed his son into exactly the kind of monster he himself had been. His father had destroyed him through overt abuse. He had destroyed her through studied deception. She paused, and for an instant the fury in her eyes gave place to something far more devastating, a raw anguish that cut deeper than any anger could. Her voice dropped to a whisper that proved more lacerating than her previous accusations. "Tell me just one thing, my lord," she said, her words trembling with barely contained pain. "Was there a single moment? One look? One word? Anything that was not part of your calculated performance? Did you feel even a flicker of genuine regard when you read Wordsworth to me, when you drove me through Hyde Park, when you stood beside me at the altar?" The question hung between them, naked and terrible in its vulnerability. Marcus met her gaze, and in his silence, in the cold, empty acknowledgement in his gray eyes, she found her answer. Nothing. It had all been nothing but a carefully orchestrated deception. The knowledge extinguished something in Eliza's expression, replacing anguish with a steely resolve that was somehow more final than rage. She would not leave, she told him with renewed composure, for she had nowhere to go and no resources. She would remain as Marchioness because law and society gave her no alternative. But their marriage was finished in any meaningful sense. She would raise Thomas, manage the household, fulfill social obligations. But she would never again pretend affection for him. She would never again waste romantic hopes on the shell of a man incapable of genuine human connection. She left him alone in his study, returning to the nursery where Thomas stirred from his nap. She held him while Sarah fetched the wet nurse, and she found herself weeping silently into his soft hair. She had believed that love could heal all wounds, that patience could thaw any frozen heart. She had been catastrophically wrong. The Marquis remained in his study long after Eliza departed, staring at nothing. He felt nothing, not shame, not regret. His father's training had been thorough, yet some small part of him recognized uncomfortable truth. He had become his father in all the ways that mattered. He had inflicted premeditated cruelty on someone who had done nothing to deserve it. But recognizing truth and feeling appropriate emotion were entirely different things. And Marcus Thornley had long since lost the ability to feel anything beyond cold satisfaction of vengeance completed. Or so he told himself, sitting alone as night fell over Derbyshire hills. But late that night, unable to sleep, Marcus found himself wandering the darkened corridors of Wintermere Hall. His feet carried him without conscious direction to the long gallery where portraits of his ancestors gazed down with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to cold hauteur. He stopped before the portrait of his mother, painted when she was barely 20, younger than Eliza was now. Lady Anne Thornley had died when Marcus was 7, carried off by fever so quickly that he had barely had time to comprehend his loss before his father had forbidden him from speaking her name again. In the portrait, she looked gentle and kind, with gray eyes that seemed to hold warmth even in oil paint. His father had kept the painting only because removing it would have caused talk, but he had relegated it to the furthest corner of the gallery where it could be conveniently forgotten. Marcus stared up at his mother's face, and for just a moment, something twisted in his chest. A sensation so long suppressed that he almost failed to recognize it. It felt like grief or perhaps regret. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. What would his mother have thought of what he had become? Of what he had done to Eliza? He pushed the thought away with practiced efficiency, turning sharply from the portrait. His revenge was complete. His father's legacy was destroyed. Nothing else signified. But as he walked back through the silent halls, he could not quite shake the image of those painted gray eyes, so like Eliza's, looking at him with what might have been disappointment. The months that followed transformed Wintermere Hall into a house divided against itself. Eliza fulfilled duties as Marchioness with mechanical efficiency while investing genuine energy into Thomas's care. The infant thrived under her devoted attention. The Marquis maintained his pattern of isolation. He attended necessary social functions with his wife, presenting the united front society expected. But the coldness between them was palpable. Sarah watched over both mistress and master with keen observation. She noticed how Lady Wintermere never spoke to her husband except when necessary, how she turned her face away when he entered rooms. But Sarah also noticed something else that disturbed her. The Marquis had taken to visiting the nursery at odd hours, not when Eliza was present, but during times when only staff attended to Thomas. He would stand in the doorway, never entering fully, simply watching the child with an expression Sarah could not quite interpret. Spring arrived, transforming the harsh Derbyshire landscape. Thomas, now 6 months old, had begun displaying personality beyond mere infant needs. He smiled easily, laughed with genuine delight. Eliza sang to him constantly, filling the nursery with ballads and folk songs. Her voice carried through the halls, adding warmth to spaces that had been cold for generations. In April, Eliza received a letter from William Hertford. He was planning to remarry and expressed hope he might visit occasionally to maintain some connection with his son. Eliza responded with generous permission. She felt no resentment. Indeed, she felt grateful that circumstances had brought Thomas into her life. She was writing her response when the Marquess appeared. He had received correspondence from his man of business in London. There were matters requiring his personal attention, potentially extending to several weeks. He would be departing in 2 days. He did not ask if she wished to accompany him. He simply informed her of his plans. Eliza nodded acknowledgement without looking up, making clear through indifference that his comings and goings were of no consequence to her. He departed 2 days later. The household breathed easier in his absence, and Eliza found herself able to smile more genuinely. She should have been content with this arrangement, but some part of her felt a peculiar ache, not longing for her husband's presence exactly, but grief for what might have been had circumstances been different. She was contemplating this uncomfortable truth one afternoon in late May when Sarah burst into the morning room with a letter that had just arrived from London. It came from the Marquess's valet. The Marquess had been attacked near his London residence 3 nights prior, a robbery attempt that had turned violent when he resisted. He had sustained significant injuries, a blow to the head leaving him unconscious for 2 days, and a knife wound to his side that had fortunately missed vital organs but had resulted in dangerous blood loss. The physicians attending him had stabilized his condition, but he remained weak and confused, suffering from headaches and occasional disorientation, suggesting his head injury had been severe. The valet requested her instructions regarding whether she wished to travel to London. Eliza read the letter twice. By all rights, she should feel nothing. The man had used her abominably. Yet she found herself feeling something that surprised her. Not joy at his suffering, not indifference, but peculiar concern having nothing to do with wifely duty and everything to do with simple human compassion. She made her choice with decisiveness that had emerged from the wreckage of her romantic illusions. She would go to London, not out of love, but because duty demanded it, and because she would not allow herself to become as cold and unfeeling as he had proven himself to be. She arranged for Thomas to remain at Wintermere Hall with Sarah, unwilling to expose an infant to travel risks. She departed the following morning toward London, and the husband she had once loved, but now felt only duty toward. What she did not know was that the blow to the Marquess's head had done something far more significant than merely causing pain. It had somehow damaged whatever mechanism in his mind had allowed him to suppress his capacity for feeling. And the man she would encounter in London would be profoundly different from the cold husband she had left behind. Eliza arrived to find the household in controlled chaos. The valet, Simmons, greeted her with obvious relief. The physician attending him was Dr. Westerly, whose reputation for treating head injuries had made him the natural choice. He briefed Eliza on his patient's condition with careful precision. The head injury had been severe, resulting in unconsciousness followed by confusion and disorientation. The patient had gradually regained clarity, but something peculiar had occurred that Dr. Westerly had never before encountered. The blow appeared to have caused a severe shock to his nervous system, the physician explained, a disruption that had shaken the rigid control the Marquess had maintained over his temperament. Where previously he had been renowned for cold reserve, he now displayed emotions with unsettling openness. The injury seemed to have disturbed the balance of his constitution, resulting in an exhibition of sentiments that before he had kept under the most severe restraint. He wept easily. He expressed affection toward servants in ways that startled them. He spoke of his father with raw anguish rather than controlled resentment. Most disturbingly, he had asked repeatedly for his wife, expressing concern about her welfare and regret about his treatment of her with emotional intensity, contradicting everything they knew of his character. Dr. Westerly could not fully explain the phenomenon. The head injury might have affected his ability to maintain the disciplined comportment that had previously defined his manner. The change might be temporary or might prove permanent. Time alone would reveal which. Eliza absorbed this with growing apprehension. She had prepared to nurse an injured husband while maintaining emotional distance. She had not anticipated encountering a fundamentally different person. Simmons escorted her to the master bedchamber. The Marquis lay propped against pillows, his head bandaged and his face pale. He looked diminished by injury in ways having nothing to do with physical size. He turned his head when she entered, and something extraordinary happened to his features. They transformed with an expression of such relief and joy that Eliza actually stepped backward in shock. This was not the cold man she had married. This was someone entirely different, someone whose gray eyes filled with tears at the sight of her. He attempted to rise but fell back with a grimace. Eliza moved forward automatically and found her hands captured in his with a grip trembling from weakness but conveying desperate need. He was so sorry, he told her, so profoundly sorry for what he had done. The words tumbled out in disordered rush, completely unlike his usual careful speech. He had been a monster, exactly as she had accused. He had used her abominably. He had been lying here unable to maintain the walls he had built, and everything he had suppressed for years had come flooding back. He could feel again, not just anger and satisfaction in revenge, but grief and shame and regret, and all the messy emotions he had trained himself to deny. And what he felt most acutely was horror at what he had done to her. Eliza found herself unable to respond, struck mute by the transformation. This might be temporary, she reminded herself. Dr. Westerly had warned the change might not be permanent. She could not allow herself to be drawn back into hope, only to have it destroyed again. She informed him calmly that she had come to ensure he received proper care during recovery. Once he had healed, she would return to Windermere Hall and Thomas. The fundamental reality of their marriage remained unchanged. The Marquis flinched as though she had struck him, but he nodded acceptance. He understood he had forfeited any right to her trust or affection. The weeks that followed proved extraordinarily difficult. Eliza maintained her intention to provide competent care while protecting herself emotionally, but the Marquis's transformation made distance increasingly hard to maintain. He asked her to tell him about her experience of their marriage, not to make excuses, but to truly comprehend what she had endured. He listened with visible pain, suggesting genuine comprehension of the harm he had caused. He acknowledged that his father's cruelty did not excuse his own, that trauma might explain but did not justify. He spoke haltingly about his childhood, about a wound to his spirit inflicted through relentless cruelty disguised as paternal discipline. But he also acknowledged he had made choices, that he had deliberately used his wife as instrument of revenge. Eliza found herself drawn into conversations she had not intended to have. Understanding why someone had hurt you did not erase the hurt, but it made maintaining pure resentment more difficult. Most troubling was growing evidence that this change was not simply a matter of emotional display, but of genuine transformation. He began asking about Thomas, not as an heir in whom he had no real interest, but as the child Eliza loved. He wanted to know about his personality, his development, the small daily details. He did not ask to see Thomas yet, acknowledging he had not earned that privilege. But he spoke of hoping to know the boy eventually, if Eliza could ever trust him. Dr. Westerly became increasingly convinced the change would prove permanent. Whatever mechanism had allowed him to suppress emotions appeared to have been irreparably damaged. He would need to learn to live with the full range of human feeling. As June arrived and the Marquis's physical injuries healed, Eliza found herself facing a decision she had not anticipated. She had planned to return to Windermere Hall once his recovery made her presence unnecessary. But the man she was preparing to leave was not the same man. The question was whether that difference was sufficient to merit giving their marriage another chance, not to recapture romantic illusions that had been destroyed, but to attempt to build something real and honest from the ruins. The decision crystallized on a warm June evening when Eliza found the Marquis in his study, surrounded by papers. He had recovered sufficiently to resume responsibilities. Eliza entered to inform him she had decided to return to Derbyshire the following week. Thomas would be approaching 9 months old, and her absence troubled her. The Marquis received this news with visible distress he made no attempt to disguise. He asked, with hesitation suggesting he anticipated rejection, whether he might return to Windermere Hall with her. Not to resume their previous arrangement, but to attempt to build something different, a relationship based on honesty rather than deception. He wanted to know Thomas. Not as a tool of revenge, but as the child who had become the center of Eliza's world. He wanted to learn how to be the kind of man who might eventually deserve a place in her life and their son's life. He did not ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. He asked only for opportunity to try to become someone worthy of such consideration. Eliza found herself suspended between caution, born of bitter experience, and dangerous stirring of something that might have been hope. She observed him carefully, seeing not the man who had destroyed her, but the man that her son and the child growing within her womb might have as a father. Her decision was not about forgiving the unforgivable past. That wound would remain, a permanent scar upon her spirit. This was about the future. She would give her children the chance to have a father who was present and attempting redemption, but her finger would remain poised upon the trigger. The mercy she extended was for the children. The vigilance she maintained was for herself. She would build the best future she could for Thomas and the babe she carried, but she would never again be the naive girl who had believed in fairy tales. She told him, choosing words with careful precision, that she would permit him to return to Windermere Hall. But there would be conditions. He would occupy separate apartments, would make no presumptions about resuming marital intimacy, would earn any access to Thomas through demonstrated trustworthiness. He would submit to her judgment about when and whether he had changed sufficiently to merit fuller inclusion in their family life. Most importantly, if she discovered his transformation was temporary, if his emotional walls reasserted themselves, she would banish him permanently. She would endure loneliness rather than subject herself again to the methodical destruction of hope. The Marquis accepted these terms without hesitation. They would return to Derbyshire together, but as wary strangers attempting to negotiate new terms rather than as husband and wife resuming a relationship. The journey proceeded in careful stages. During the long hours in the carriage, they engaged in conversations bearing no resemblance to the strained silence of their honeymoon journey. He asked about her childhood, her relationship with Margaret, her father's influence. He listened with genuine attention and shared his own experiences with halting discomfort of someone unaccustomed to such vulnerability. Eliza found herself gradually relaxing her guard, not into trust exactly, but into tentative willingness to consider the possibility he might be capable of genuine change. They arrived at Windermere Hall in early July. Thomas had grown during Eliza's absence, no longer an infant, but a robust baby who had begun attempting to pull himself upright. Eliza swept him into her arms with fierce joy. She had missed him with surprising intensity. The Marquis observed this reunion from careful distance, making no attempt to intrude. His expression held such naked longing that Sarah, watching, felt her assumptions about his character undergo fundamental revision. The weeks that followed established new patterns. The Marquis maintained separate chambers as agreed. He devoted himself to estate management with new attention to how decisions affected tenants and servants. He began, with Eliza's cautious permission, to spend brief periods in Thomas's presence. Initially, these were merely observational. Thomas seemed unbothered by this new presence. Gradually, as the Marquis demonstrated consistent gentleness, Eliza permitted more direct interaction. He proved awkward at first, but approached the challenge with determination. He learned how to hold Thomas properly, how to entertain him, how to soothe him. Sarah watched with approval, noting how Lord Windermere's face softened when Thomas laughed, how he displayed infinite patience with infant unpredictability. But the real test came in August, when Eliza's courses failed to arrive at their expected time. She noticed the delay with initial confusion, then with dawning horror as she calculated timing. The marriage had been consummated during those early months, but there had been that single night after his injury when he had been feverish and confused, when she had been nursing him through a difficult episode. He had reached for her in his delirium, seeking comfort rather than conjugal satisfaction, and she had responded with compassionate presence. The encounter had been so different from his previous mechanical visits that it had not occurred to her to consider consequences. But now, as she recognized the signs, she understood with crystalline clarity that she was pregnant. Not through deliberate choice, but through a single moment of human connection during his illness. The irony was almost unbearable. After months of believing herself barren, she had conceived during the one encounter motivated by compassion. She sat in her chambers, hands pressed to her still flat abdomen, trying to sort through chaotic emotions. Fear, certainly. Pregnancy carried mortal risks, as Margaret's death had demonstrated. Anger at the cosmic jest, allowing conception now. And underneath it all, complicated joy. But the question that paralyzed her was how to tell the Marquis. This pregnancy represented the very thing he had worked so deliberately to prevent. Would the news cause his emotional walls to reassert themselves? Would he revert to the cold man who had married her for revenge? Or had he changed sufficiently that he could accept this development, perhaps even welcome it? She delayed the revelation for weeks, watching him carefully for any signs his emotional openness was diminishing. But he seemed, if anything, to be growing more comfortable with emotional expression rather than less. Finally, in September, when her condition could not be hidden much longer, Eliza requested a private interview. They met in the library. She told him directly, without preamble. She was pregnant, likely from that fevered night during his illness. The child would arrive sometime in late winter or early spring. She wanted him to know so he could decide how to proceed. The Marquis sat motionless as the information penetrated. For a terrifying instant, his face became an impenetrable mask, an echo of the cold man she had confronted in this very room months before. His features held no expression, no hint of the emotional openness he had displayed since his injury. The silence stretched unbearably, and Eliza felt her heart turn to ice in her chest, convinced that the shock had rebuilt the walls that trauma had torn down. She had been a fool to hope, a fool to believe that genuine transformation was possible. Then the mask shattered. His face crumpled, cycling through emotions too complex and swift to catalog individually. Shock, certainly, fear unmistakably, but also something that could only be described as wonder, pure, unguarded, overwhelming wonder. When he finally spoke, his voice shook with emotion he made no attempt to control. This child would be his chance to be the kind of father his own father had never been. A chance to break the cycle of cruelty defining the Wintermere line. A chance to create something good from blood he had viewed as cursed. He asked, with heartbreaking uncertainty, whether she would permit him to be truly involved in this child's life from the beginning. Not merely as legal father providing material support, but as a parent attempting to offer love rather than cruelty. He understood if she could not trust him with such responsibility. He had proven himself capable of terrible deliberation where children were concerned. She had every right to protect this child. Eliza found tears streaming down her face as she listened, hearing genuine transformation rather than studied performance. She told him she would give him the opportunity to be a true father. But the chance came with absolute conditions. Any sign of the coldness characterizing their early marriage, any indication he was reverting to viewing people as instruments, and she would protect her children with every resource at her disposal. He accepted these terms with gratitude of someone receiving a gift beyond deserving. The news spread through the household with typical servant speed. The reaction was universally positive. Only Sarah recognized the deeper significance. Triumph, because conception proved Lady Wintermere had never been barren. Test, because the Marquis's response would reveal whether his transformation was genuine. But as autumn progressed and the pregnancy advanced normally, Sarah observed with growing conviction that Lord Windermere's change appeared permanent. He attended to his wife with solicitous care, respecting her boundaries while offering genuine support. He continued building his relationship with Thomas with patience and warmth. And he spoke of the coming child with mixture of joy and terror, suggesting he fully comprehended the magnitude of responsibility he was accepting. The terror was actually reassuring. A man who felt no apprehension about fatherhood either possessed unrealistic confidence or had not truly grasped what parenthood entailed. October brought news that William Hertford had remarried. The letter included warm wishes and expressed Hertford's gratitude for Thomas's life at Windermere Hall. The pregnancy proceeded normally through November and into December, though Eliza found herself battling fears that Margaret's fate might become her own. The Marquis, with newly developed sensitivity, recognized her terror and responded with reassurance that never dismissed her fears as irrational. He arranged for Dr. Westerly to travel from London for the confinement. Dr. Westerly arrived in early January, settling into guest chambers to await the birth. He took opportunity to examine the Marquis's recovery, pronouncing himself satisfied while remaining intrigued by the permanent alteration. Lady Windermere's labor began on a bitter January night. The household sprang into organized chaos that attended births in great houses. The Marquis, forbidden from the birthing chamber by propriety, paced the corridor outside with Thomas in his arms. The boy had woken from the commotion and had begun to fuss. Holding him, walking him, soothing him gave the Marquis something to do while terror consumed his thoughts. He understood, with visceral clarity born of newly recovered emotional capacity, that he might lose her. That childbirth claimed women with frightening regularity. That Margaret's death stood as recent reminder of how quickly joy could transform into tragedy. Sarah found him holding Thomas while silent tears streamed down his face, and she felt the last of her reservations about his transformation dissolve. This was not performance. This was genuine terror, born of genuine love. The labor proved long and difficult, stretching through the night into the following day. Dr. Westerly emerged periodically to inform the Marquis that progress continued normally, that no complications had yet developed. But "not yet" provided cold comfort. It was late afternoon when the infant's cry finally rang through the upper halls, announcing successful delivery. Dr. Westerly emerged, his face showing exhaustion but also satisfaction. Lady Windermere had been safely delivered of a healthy daughter. Both mother and child had survived. The Marquis stood frozen, unable to process information that exceeded his highest hopes. A daughter, Eliza, alive. Both of them safe, despite the dangers that had claimed Margaret. Dr. Westerly suggested Lord Windermere might wish to meet his daughter. The birthing chamber had been restored to proper order, and both mother and infant awaited his presence. He entered with trembling legs, seeing Eliza propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle. She looked up at his entrance, her face transforming with a smile holding none of the wariness that had characterized their interactions for months. She had someone for him to meet, she said softly, adjusting the linens to reveal a small face with features still swollen from birth. Their daughter, she announced, whom she thought they might name Eleanor after her grandmother. The Marquis approached slowly, as though sudden movement might shatter the moment. He gazed down at the infant, his daughter, his child, visible proof he had been granted opportunity to be the kind of father he had never known, and felt his heart break open with love so pure and overwhelming he nearly collapsed from its weight. He reached out with shaking hand to touch the impossibly soft cheek, marveling at the perfection of fingers that curled instinctively around his own. Eliza watched her husband fall completely in love with their daughter, and she felt something shift in her own heart. This was not the return of her romantic illusions. Those had been destroyed too thoroughly. This was something more real and more durable. Recognition that the man before her had undertaken genuine transformation, and was continuing to work toward becoming someone worthy of the family they were building. She would never forget what he had done to her in the early months. The premeditated cruelty, the studied deception, the methodical destruction of her self-worth, these injuries had marked her permanently. But she could see now that people were capable of change, that trauma did not excuse cruelty, but neither did it permanently define one's capacity for growth. Her husband had been broken by his father's abuse, had responded with his own calculated cruelty. But the injury, forcing him to confront emotions he had spent his life denying, had given him opportunity for genuine transformation. He would need to work every day to be the kind of husband and father he had never learned to be. There would be failures and setbacks. But for the first time since their wedding, Eliza felt hope that the work might eventually produce something worth having. She extended her free hand toward him, and he took it with trembling fingers, his tears falling freely now. They sat together in the birthing chamber, husband and wife, father and mother, two damaged people attempting to build something good from the ruins of vengeance and romantic illusion. As Marcus gazed at his wife and his newborn daughter, he felt a love so overwhelming it was almost painful in its intensity. And within that joy, he felt also the crushing weight of responsibility, the awareness that each day would require effort to prove himself worthy of this happiness, a constant struggle against the specter of the man he had been. His father's cruelty had nearly destroyed him entirely. His family's love would be his slow and deliberate reconstruction. The work would never truly end, he understood. But holding Eleanor's impossibly small hand in his, watching Eliza's exhausted smile, he thought that perhaps the work itself was the point, that redemption was not a destination, but a journey undertaken one careful step at a time. It would not be easy. The road ahead would require patience, forgiveness that must be earned rather than assumed, and constant vigilance against the patterns of behavior that had nearly destroyed them both. But as Eliza looked at her husband cradling their daughter's tiny hand in his, seeing the wonder and terror and fierce love in his face, she thought that perhaps, after all the pain and betrayal, they might actually have a chance at building something real, not the fairy tale romance she had once imagined. Something harder and more honest. A partnership forged through suffering and transformation, bound not by romantic illusion, but by shared commitment to breaking the cycles that had damaged them both. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, and sometimes through the ruins of vengeance itself, transforming premeditated cruelty into genuine redemption, one difficult, honest step at a time.